behind that sprawling plantation house down in Wilkes County, Georgia, the one they called Hollow Pines, there was a cage. And that cage lived in the nightmares of every enslaved soul for a good 50 miles in every direction. It wasn't tucked away in some shadowy corner where Augustus Forum's fancy neighbors might accidentally overlook it while sipping their sweet tea on social visits.
Oh no.
Augustus Forum was proud of what he'd built. He made sure it stood right where visitors couldn't miss it as they approached his grand mansion. A deliberate display, a showcase of power, a philosophy of control built on sheer, absolute terror. The thing was 30 feet by 30 feet, iron bars thick as a grown man's arm. They'd forged those bars special at a foundry in Savannah, hauled them out to Hollow Pines by wagon, and driven them 8 feet deep into that red Georgia clay before bolting them together with rivets the size of a child's fist. The spacing was precise, exactly 18 in apart, wide enough so the 100+ enslaved folks forced to witness its terrible purpose could see every single detail of what happened inside, but narrow enough that no human could ever squeeze through. The top was barred too. A complete enclosure. No shelter from that brutal Georgia sun that would turn the interior into an oven by midday. No water source. No mercy. Not a single merciful thing about its design. The floor was just packed earth, but stained so dark with blood over the years that in certain light it looked black. And scattered across that floor were things that made visitors quickly look away, and made the enslaved folks forced to clean it occasionally retch in horror. Bones, mostly human bones. Whatever that beast hadn't completely consumed. Some still have scraps of cloth clinging, rough homespun, the only kind enslaved people wore. Occasionally other things too, parts of people. Fragments the Georgia sun had dried into leathery remnants that didn't even look human anymore. The smell coming from that cage. People who experienced it said they could never forget it. Old blood soaked into earth that couldn't wash away even when those rare Georgia rains came. Death and fear and something wild and wrong. A smell that carried on the wind and reminded every person at Hollow Pines exactly what waited for anyone who dared dream of freedom. Inside that cage lived something Augustus Forum had spent 5 years and a considerable fortune creating. Beast was a black bear, Ursus americanus, pushing 600 lb of pure muscle, rage, and hunger. Now, black bears normally eat whatever they can find. Berries, nuts, insects, not usually meat. They're shy around humans. Avoid confrontation. A natural black bear would rather run than fight every time. But Beast wasn't natural anymore. Not by a long shot. Forum bought the animal as a cub from some trapper up in the North Georgia mountains. Paid a price that could have bought 3 prime field hands. Brought it to Hollow Pines and started a training regimen as systematic as it was horrifying. He studied bear baiting, that cruel English sport where they chain up bears and set dogs on them for entertainment. Read accounts from ancient Rome about training animals for the Colosseum. Applied every lesson with dedication that might have been admirable if it wasn't so fundamentally evil. The training was simple in concept, brutal in execution. Starve the bear for days until it's weak and desperate. Then throw an enslaved person in, usually someone elderly or sick, low economic value, but whose death would educate the others. The bear learned that humans appearing meant food, that the smell of human fear meant feeding time. That violence got rewarded and hesitation got punished with more starvation, more beatings with iron rods through the bars, more pain. Over 5 years, they systematically destroyed Beast's natural instincts and replaced them with something serving only one purpose. That animal had claws that could open a man from throat to belly in one swipe. Jaws strong enough to crack a human femur like kindling. Teeth that tore through muscle and sinew with terrifying ease. and it had learned to prefer human flesh over anything else, learned to associate certain sounds and smells with the pleasure of feeding. 17 people beast killed in those 5 years. 17 human beings thrown into that cage. Not one survived even 5 full minutes, let alone the 24 hours forum, always promised as the price of freedom. Because that's how Augustus Forum's system worked. And everyone at Hollow Pines knew the rules, because Forum made absolutely certain they did. He explained them regularly, repeated them at the slightest provocation, wanted them burned into every mind so deeply that even thinking about escape would trigger immediate terror. When someone tried to run from Hollow Pines, if they got caught alive, they received what Forum called a gentleman's choice. Option 1, accept immediate execution by hanging. Happens at dawn next day, relatively quick. Your body gets buried in that small plot behind the quarters where other enslaved folks who died are laid to rest. Option 2, enter the cage with beast for 24 hours. Survive those 24 hours, Forum promised he'd personally sign your manumission papers. Grant you freedom, give you 5. Let you walk away from Hollow Pines as free men or women. A lie, of course. Everyone suspected it was a lie, but it gave Forum exactly what he wanted, which wasn't actually dead runaways. Dead runaways were easy. Any plantation owner with dogs and guns could manage that. What Augustus Forum wanted was fear so absolute, so bone, deep in soul, destroying, that it killed hope before hope could even root in people's hearts. He wanted every enslaved person at Hollow Pines to know that even if they ran, even if they somehow survived the swamps and dogs and armed patrols, even if they miraculously lasted 24 hours in that cage, freedom was still just a lie on the other side of bars. The cage delivered that fear with ruthless efficiency. In 5 years, 17 people got thrown inside. Some fought, screaming, swinging fists at 600 lb of trained killer until those claws opened them up and the screaming stopped. Some prayed, calling on Jesus and God and ancestors until beasts' jaws closed around their throats and the prayers died into wet, choking sounds. Some just stood still waiting for death, already dead inside, just letting their bodies catch up. One man, Daniel, a young field worker, incredibly strong and agile, managed to climb the bars and hang from the top. Fingers locked around iron, pulling his body as far from the ground as possible. Beast just sat beneath him, patient as stone, waiting. Daniel lasted 3 minutes and 47 seconds before exhaustion forced his fingers open, and he fell into those waiting jaws. Not one person survived even 5 minutes, let alone 24 hours. The promise of freedom was bait for a trap with no escape. Had never had any escape, would never have any escape as long as Augustus Forum drew breath and beast lived in that cage. Until the day they threw Elias in. Elias was born into slavery on the Whitfield Plantation in South Carolina, 1825. No memory of freedom, never knew it. Earliest memories were his mother's hands, rough and scarred from years of fieldwork. Hands that stroked his hair at night, singing songs in a language she said came from across the ocean. From a place called home she'd never see again. He remembered her face. Worry lines carved around her eyes and mouth, making her look ancient though she was barely 30. Remembered the day the Whitfield estate got divided among 3 sons after the old master died. How his mother screamed as they separated her 3 children, selling them to different buyers like cattle at auction. Elias was 7 years old, standing on a platform in Charleston, watching his mother and 2 sisters disappear into the crowd, while a white man smelling of tobacco and whiskey examined his teeth and felt his arms to judge how much work he might do once he got some growth. That man was Augustus Forum, expanding his Georgia operations, looking for young slaves to train up. The journey from Charleston to Hollow Pines took 5 days in a wagon. Young Elias chained to 3 other children and 2 adult men, all property being transported like furniture to their new location. When they arrived and Elias first saw the cage, saw a beast pacing inside, even then, a younger animal still being trained, something cold settled into his stomach. A knowing, an understanding that this place was going to take everything from him if it could. 19 years Elias survived at Hollow Pines, survived by learning to be invisible. Eyes down, mouth shut. Work hard enough to avoid punishment, but not so hard he stood out. Survived by making no friends close enough that their loss would break him. Because people died at Hollow Pines regularly, worked to death in the fields. Dead from disease untreated, dead from beatings that went too far. Dead in that cage when they dared dream of freedom, survived by keeping that small flame of his own dreams buried so deep inside that sometimes he almost forgot it was there. But it was there, always there. A tiny coal of defiant slavery couldn't quite extinguish, no matter how much water it poured on, no matter how much dirt piled on top. Elias never spoke about freedom, never talked about the North, or the stories people whispered about an underground railroad, never did anything that might make Forum or his overseers think he was trouble. But inside, where no whip could reach, no chain could bind, that coal glowed warm and red and patient. That patience lasted until the day he met Thomas and Samuel. The brothers arrived at Hollow Pines on a humid July afternoon in 1851, purchased from a smaller Alabama plantation that went bankrupt after a series of bad cotton harvests. Thomas was 21. Samuel was 19. Neither had learned yet how to be invisible. They still walked straight-backed, still looked overseers in the eye, still had that dangerous thing called hope burning bright and obvious in their faces. Elias noticed them immediately. They stood out like torches in darkness. He tried to ignore them, knew getting close to people like that was a good way to end up dead or in the cage. But Thomas and Samuel seemed to gravitate toward him anyway. Maybe because Elias was one of the few people at Hollow Pines who'd been there long enough to know how everything worked. Or maybe because they sensed beneath his careful invisibility that same flame burned. They worked the same cotton fields, moving down endless rows under that brutal Georgia sun, making the air shimmer and turning sweat to salt crystals on dark skin. During brief water breaks when overseers were far enough away not to hear, the brothers would whisper to Elias about the Underground Railroad, about Quakers and free black people in the North who helped runaways, about routes through the swamps dogs couldn't follow, about a world beyond Hollow Pines where a man could own himself. "We're going," Thomas told Elias one evening after work, voice low but vibrating with certainty. 2 weeks from now, when the moon's dark and the night's at its blackest, there's a path through the swamp, follows the creek north until it hits the river. Other side of that river, there's people who help. We're doing it, Elias, and you should come with us. And every survival instinct Elias developed over 19 years screamed at him to say no. He'd seen too many people try to escape. Seen the ones who came back broken and bleeding before being thrown into the cage. Heard the screams from inside those iron bars. Screams that went on far longer than seemed possible until they finally stopped and the awful work of cleaning began. Seen beast. Smelled the creature's rank animal smell. Watched it pace. Knew exactly what it could do to human flesh. But when Elias looked at Thomas and Samuel, looked at that hope burning in their eyes, something responded in his own chest. That buried coal flared, sent warmth through his body. Reminded him he was 26 years old and had never made a single choice about his own life. Not one. Every decision. From when he woke to what he ate to where he worked to whether he lived or died, had been made by white men who owned his body, and thought they owned his soul too. Maybe they were wrong. Maybe freedom was possible. Maybe, just maybe, if he was smart and careful and lucky, he could be something other than property. Could walk on earth as a man instead of a thing. So against every survival instinct, against all the carefully learned caution of 19 years, Elias heard himself say yes. They planned carefully over the next 2 weeks. Saved every scrap of food from meager rations, hiding dried corn and bits of fatback in an old tree hollow at the cotton field's edge. Studied overseer patrol patterns, learning when and where guards were laziest, when they drank too much whiskey and dozed at their posts. Watched the moon, waiting for it to shrink from full to crescent to that perfect darkness when even starlight seemed dim. And kept their plan secret, told no one else because fewer people knowing meant less chance of betrayal. But they made one critical mistake, one error in judgment that would cost Thomas and Samuel their lives and change everything for Elias. They trusted Jacob. Jacob was 53 years old and had been at Hollow Pines for over 30 years. Longer than anyone else still alive on the plantation. The brothers thought this made him wise. Thought his survival meant he knew secrets about navigating forearm's cruelty. They didn't understand that Jacob survived precisely because he'd learned the only way to stay alive at Hollow Pines was to never threaten the system that oppressed him. He'd learned resistance brought death. Defiance brought the cage. The only way to see tomorrow was to make sure Forearm felt completely secure in his power. When Jacob overheard Thomas and Samuel whispering about escape plans, about the swamp route and timing and Elias going with them, he made a calculation taking less than 30 seconds. His survival was worth more than their freedom. Forearm rewarded those who helped maintain control. Slightly better rations, easier work assignments, small privileges making the difference between dying at 50 and maybe making it to 60. Jacob told the overseers everything. The escape night arrived with perfect conditions. Storm clouds obscured the moon completely. Warm rain began falling, the kind that washes away scent and makes tracking difficult even for the best dogs. Thomas, Samuel, and Elias slipped out of the slave quarters at midnight, moving with the silence of men knowing their lives depended on making no sound. The plan. Separate at the cotton field's edge. Brothers head west toward the creek, following it north to the river. Elias go east through a different swamp part before circling north to meet them at a predetermined spot 3 miles away. Separating meant if one group got caught, others might still make it. Smart strategy. The kind of tactics that might have worked, but the overseers already knew everything. Had known for 2 days. Had been preparing. Had positioned men at both likely escape routes. They were waiting. Thomas and Samuel made it almost a mile into the swamp before the dogs found them. The brothers heard barking first, getting louder, closer, accompanied by overseer shouts and men splashing through water. They ran. Pushed through dense vegetation tearing at their skin. Tried reaching deeper water, where dogs might lose the scent. The first rifle shot echoed across the swamp like thunder, drowning even the rain. Thomas felt impact before he heard sound. Felt the bullet punch through his back and exit his chest. Felt his legs stop working as he pitched forward into dark water. Tried calling out to his brother, but lungs full of blood, only a wet gurgle came out. He died face down in 6 inches of swamp water. Last thought a desperate hope that Samuel would make it, would find freedom, would live the life they dreamed about. Samuel heard the shot and his brother's fall. Wanted to go back, wanted to help. But survival instinct overrode love and he kept running. Made it another 100 yards before a second shot rang out. This one from a different direction. The bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him into deeper water. He tried swimming, tried diving, but the chains they'd been too afraid to try removing beforehand dragged him down. His last sensation was water filling his lungs and the terrible realization they'd been betrayed. Elias, moving through a different swamp section, heard both shots. In that moment, he knew with absolute certainty his friends were dead. The plan had failed. Someone had talked. He should have kept running. Should have put as much distance as possible between himself and hollow pines. Should have abandoned the meeting point and struck out alone toward the north and whatever uncertain freedom might wait there. But Elias had spent several hours crawling through the swamp's densest part, through vegetation so thick he'd had to force his way between plants, through water stinking of rot thick with plant matter. His clothes soaked not just with water, but with sap and oils from dozens of plants. His skin burned slightly from contact with various leaves and stems. He was covered in mud and crushed vegetation and the swamp's own smell. Among the plants he'd brushed against was one the Creek Indians, forced westward on the Trail of Tears, had called ghost root. It grew in standing water, had broad leaves releasing sticky, pungent sap when damaged, and a smell so strong and distinctive most animals avoided it instinctively. Creek hunters sometimes rubbed this plant on their skin before hunting, using its powerful scent to mask human smell and confuse prey. Elias didn't know any of this. He just knew his skin itched and burned where plant matter contacted it, and he was lost and terrified, hearing pursuit sounds getting closer. The dogs picked up his trail easily at first, following his path through the swamp with the confidence of animals who'd hunted humans many times before. But as they got closer to where Elias hid, crouched behind a fallen cypress, chest deep in foul water, the dogs began behaving strangely. Their barking became uncertain, confused. They circled and whined, noses telling them something was nearby, but brains unable to process conflicting information. The scent trail led here, but the prey didn't smell right anymore. Didn't smell like prey at all. Actually smelled like plant and swamp, and something acidic making them sneeze. The overseer leading the dogs, Crawford, who'd hunted runaways for 15 years and trusted his animals absolutely, couldn't understand what was happening. The dogs had never acted like this. He pushed them forward, cursing, but they refused to go further. One actually sat down and refused to move, looking up at Crawford with confused, troubled eyes, but wild dogs were confused, Crawford wasn't. He began moving through the swamp himself, rifle ready, eyes scanning. He almost missed Elias entirely. Might have walked right past him in darkness and rain, except that in his terror Elias shifted position slightly and his foot made a small splash. Crawford spun toward the sound, rifle coming up. "Got you," he said, and pulled the trigger. The rifle misfired. Water had gotten into the mechanism, dampened the powder. Crawford had a moment to look surprised before Elias, operating on pure survival instinct, launched himself from hiding. The two men collided and went down together in muddy water, struggling. Elias had never fought an overseer before, never raised his hand in violence against a white person in his entire life, because that was suicide, pure and simple. But with Thomas and Samuel dead, with his own death certain anyway, something broke open inside him. All the rage he'd buried for 19 years came flooding out. The fight was brief and desperate. Crawford was bigger and had fighting experience, but Elias had desperation and 19 years of anger driving his fists. They rolled through the water, hitting and choking, until Elias's hand found a piece of broken cypress branch, and he brought it down on Crawford's head once, twice, 3 times until the overseer stopped moving. Elias stood up, shaking, hardly able to believe what he'd just done. He'd killed a white man. There was no coming back from that. They'd hunt him until they found him. And when they did, death would be the kindest thing he could hope for. He started to run, but didn't make it more than 30 yards. 2 more overseers emerged from different directions. Haven't heard the commotion. They had no rifles, just clubs and fists. But there were 2 of them and Elias was exhausted. The fight was over in less than a minute. They beat him viciously, taking out anger over Crawford's death. Broke 2 ribs with kicks. Split his lip, closed his left eye with a punch Elias thought might have fractured the orbital bone. Bound his hands behind his back with rope so tight it cut off circulation. Then dragged him, barely conscious, leaving a blood trail, back toward Hollow Pines as dawn began breaking over the Georgia swamp. Augustus Forum was waiting. The plantation owner had been awake all night, pacing his study, drinking whiskey, fueling his rage. 2 dead runaways he could accept. Expected even. But a dead overseer. That was different. That was rebellion. That was the kind of thing that, left unpunished in the most dramatic way possible, could give other enslaved people ideas, could make them think resistance was possible, could undermine the entire terror system he'd so carefully constructed. When they brought Elias into the courtyard, Forum was already dressed in his finest suit, as if this was a formal occasion rather than a murder. In a way, it was formal. This was ritual. This was theater. This was the performance maintaining his power. He'd had the bell rung hours ago, given orders that every single enslaved person at Hollow Pines must assemble in the courtyard. No exceptions. No excuses. Children, elderly, sick, pregnant, everyone. He wanted them all witnessing what happened to those who forgot their place. 137 people stood semicircled around the cage, some crying already, knowing what was coming, some praying silently, some simply gone numb. This wasn't the first time they'd been forced to watch someone die in that cage. Wouldn't be the last. Beast paced inside the iron bars, agitated and excited. The animal hadn't been fed in 3 days, and it could smell blood on Elias, sense the gathering people which always preceded feeding time. The bear's breath came in heavy snorts, massive head swinging back and forth as it watched proceedings with small, dark eyes holding neither cruelty nor compassion. Just hunger, just instinct. Augustus Forum walked to stand beside the cage, positioning himself where everyone could see him clearly. His voice, when he spoke, carried across the silent courtyard with practiced clarity. Elias. He began, letting the name hang. You tried to steal yourself from me. That alone would earn you death. But you also convinced 2 others to try the same. Thomas and Samuel are dead in the swamp, their bodies feeding alligators. And that's where their rebellion ends. You, however, survived the night. You even killed one of my overseers, a man worth more than 10 of you. He paused, letting that sink in, letting everyone absorb the magnitude of what Elias had done. For that, you deserve death. Slow death. Painful death. The kind of death making everyone here remember what happens when property forgets what it is. Forum smiled, and it was the smile of a man genuinely enjoying what he was about to do. But I'm a fair man. A Christian man. So I'm going to give you exactly what I give everyone who tries to steal themselves from me. A choice. He gestured toward a rope hanging from a nearby oak tree, already noosed and ready. Option 1, I hang you right now. Quick and clean. You'll be dead in minutes and we'll bury you alongside Thomas and Samuel. Or he turned to gesture at the cage. Option 2. You spend 24 hours in the cage with Beast. If you survive those 24 hours, I will personally sign your freedom papers. I'll give you $5 and a letter of transit. You'll walk out of here a free man. You have my word as a gentleman. The silence following was absolute. Everyone knew it was a lie. Everyone had seen 17 people thrown into that cage over the years, and not one survived even 5 minutes. The promise of freedom was just another cruelty, Another way to make victims choose their own death, to make them hope right up until Beast's claws opened them up. But Elias, beaten and bleeding and swaying on his feet, looked at Augustus Forum through his one good eye and made a calculation. The hanging would be quick. True. But it would change nothing. Just one more dead enslaved person, one more body in the ground, one more victory for Forum's terror system. The cage. Though, the cage had a promise attached, even if that promise was a lie. And if Elias was going to die anyway, he might as well die in a way testing that promise, forcing Forum to either honor it or publicly break his word in front of everyone. The cage, Elias said, voice rough but clear enough everyone heard. 24 hours, I want your promise. Forum's smile widened. You have it. 24 hours. If you survive, you're free. Two overseers unlocked the cage door. The sound of metal scraping on metal seemed impossibly loud in the quiet morning. Beast immediately moved toward the door. Knowing this sound meant food coming, one overseer used a long pole with a hook on the end to snag Beast's collar and pull the animal to the cage's far side, while the other shoved Elias inside. Elias hit the ground hard, broken ribs sending agony spikes through his chest. He struggled to hands and knees, then slowly, agonizingly, forced himself to stand. If he was going to die, he'd die on his feet. He wouldn't give Forum the satisfaction of seeing him cower. The cage door slammed shut with terrible finality. The lock clicked into place. Elias stood in the center of that blood-soaked earth, hands still bound behind his back, body broken and bleeding, and waited for death to come on 4 legs. Beast, released from the pole's constraint, turned its massive body toward this new thing in its territory. The animal's nostrils flared, testing air. It took one step toward Elias. Then another. The bear moved with deceptive speed for something so massive, closing the distance between them in seconds. The crowd outside held its collective breath. Some closed their eyes, unable to watch. Others forced themselves to look, because this was their friend, their fellow sufferer, and bearing witness to his death was the only honor they could offer. Beast reached Elias and stopped just inches away. The animal's breath was hot and rank, smelling of old meat and something rotten. Its eyes, small and dark in that enormous head, fixed on Elias's face. The bear's mouth opened slightly, revealing teeth yellowed with age and use. Teeth that had torn through 17 human bodies over the years. And then, slowly, Beast lowered its massive head and sniffed. The animal's nose moved across Elias's torn shirt, across the mud and plant matter still clinging to his skin, across the dried blood from his wounds. Beast sniffed his legs where rough fabric was still soaked with swamp water and covered in crushed vegetation remains. The bear made a sound, something between a huff and a growl, a sound of confusion. This prey smelled wrong, didn't smell like the others thrown into the cage. Didn't smell like fear and human and meat. Smelled like swamp, like plants, like something that Beast's ancient instincts beaten down but never completely destroyed, said was not prey. The bear took a step back, shook its massive head, sniffed again, trying to make sense of conflicting information its nose was providing. Augustus Forum, watching from outside the cage, felt the first stirring of unease. Beast, he called out, voice sharp. Beast! Kill! But Beast didn't kill. The animal circled Elias once, twice, still sniffing, still confused. Then, in a moment talked about for years afterward, the bear simply walked to the cage's far corner. The corner with a small overhang providing shade from the climbing sun. Beast lowered itself to the ground with a heavy thud, laid its massive head on its paws, and watched Elias with those dark, unreadable eyes. The crowd erupted in whispers, quickly shushed as people remembered showing too much emotion in front of Forum was dangerous. But the shock was palpable, rippling through assembled people like wind through wheat. This had never happened before. Never. Beast always attacked within seconds. Always. Elias, hardly able to believe he was still alive, stood frozen for a long moment. Then, moving with extreme care, he slowly lowered himself to sitting on the cage's opposite side. Every movement sent pain through broken ribs, but he was breathing. His heart was pounding. He was alive. Augustus Forum's face had gone red with anger and confusion. "What the hell?" he muttered. Then louder, "Beast, get up. Kill." The bear didn't even look at him. Forum grabbed an iron rod from one of the overseers and began banging it against the cage bars, creating terrible clanging that should have provoked any animal into action. He picked up stones from the ground and threw them through the bars, aiming for Beast. The stones bounced off the animal's thick hide, and Beast merely shifted position slightly, still watching Elias, but showing no inclination to attack. Hours passed. The morning sun climbed higher, turning the cage into a furnace. Elias's throat became parched, lips cracking, wounds throbbing with every heartbeat. But he remained alive, and with each passing hour, something he hadn't felt in years began growing in his chest. Hope. Forum, becoming increasingly agitated, tried everything he could think of. Had overseers bang on bars with multiple rods, creating cacophony that should have driven any animal into rage. Had them throw meat into the cage, trying to trigger Beast's feeding response. But the bear just sniffed the meat and ignored it, shouted orders and threats and curses. Voice becoming hoarse, face becoming redder, carefully cultivated control image cracking with each minute passing. By mid-afternoon, Forum had dismissed most of the crowd. Keeping everyone standing in hot sun all day served no purpose now that spectacle had failed to materialize. He left 4 overseers to watch the cage and retreated to his house, where he paced and drank and tried understanding what had gone wrong with his perfectly trained killing machine. As the sun began setting, painting Georgia's sky in orange and red shades that might have been beautiful in any other context, Elias realized something, making his heart race with emotion so powerful it almost hurt. He might actually survive this 24 hours. Forum's promise. Freedom. He allowed himself for the first time in 19 years to imagine what that might mean. Walking away from hollow pines. Finding work as a free man. Earning wages he could keep. Maybe even finding ways to help others escape. Being part of that underground railroad he'd heard whispered about. Maybe even someday finding his mother and sisters if they were still alive, if slavery hadn't already killed them. The thoughts kept him alert through the long night following. Beast remained in its corner, occasionally standing to shift position, sometimes walking to the water trough mounted on one cage side to drink, but never approaching Elias, never showing aggression. It was as if the animal had decided this particular human was something other than prey, something not fitting categories 5 years of brutal training had created. When the sun rose again, Elias had been in the cage for exactly 24 hours. He stood slowly, body stiff and screaming with pain from injuries and from a night sitting on hard ground, but alive. Incredibly, impossibly alive. He walked on trembling legs to the cage door and placed his hand on the bars. 24 hours. He called out, voice cracked from thirst, but carrying across the courtyard. I survived 24 hours. The overseers, maintaining watch, through the night looked at each other with uncertain expressions. Nothing in their experience had prepared them for this moment. No one had ever stood at that door, waiting to be released before. One of them ran to get Forum. Augustus Forum emerged from his house, looking like he hadn't slept, which he hadn't. Clothes rumpled, eyes bloodshot, face flushed with anger building all night. He walked to the cage and stood there a long moment, staring at Elias through bars. 24 hours, Elias repeated, meeting Foram's gaze with his one good eye. You gave your word. As a gentleman, you promised freedom. For a long moment, Foram said nothing. His jaw worked as if chewing words too bitter to spit out. Then his face twisted into pure rage and hatred so intense several overseers actually stepped back. My word. Foram's voice was quiet at first, then rising. My word. You think my word means anything to property. You think I'm bound by promises made to a thing I own. To an animal. To a piece of cattle that tried to steal itself and killed one of my men. He stepped closer to the bars, voice dropping to something cold and deadly. You survived through some trick, some accident of nature. But you're not leaving. You're never leaving. You'll work in my fields until you drop dead. And when you do, I'll throw your body in the swamp for the gators. Put him back in the quarters. The silence following those words was profound. Every person hearing them, enslaved and free alike, felt something shift in the air. A promise broken, an agreement violated in the most public way possible. The kind of betrayal even the most beaten down person couldn't ignore. Because if Foram's word meant nothing, if even surviving the impossible wasn't enough, then what hope was there? What was the point of anything? But more than that, Foram had just shown weakness. He'd created a situation where he either had to honor an impossible promise or show everyone his word was worthless. And he'd chosen to show his word was worthless. Every enslaved person watching would remember this. Every overseer would remember the carefully constructed image of Foram as a man of his word. Someone whose promises could be trusted. Even if his cruelty couldn't, had just shattered. The overseers unlocked the cage and pulled Elias out roughly. They shoved him toward the slave quarters, and he stumbled, body too damaged to keep balance. He landed hard in red Georgia dirt. As he lay there tasting blood and dust, Elias felt something break inside him. But it wasn't his spirit. It was fear. Fear was what had kept him alive for 19 years. What had kept him obedient? What had kept him from resisting? But what was the point of fear now? He'd survived beast. He'd earned his freedom through Foram's own rules. And it had meant nothing. If fear hadn't protected him, if obedience hadn't saved him, if even the impossible wasn't enough, then fear had no power anymore. And without fear, Augustus Foram had no power. Not really. He had violence. Yes. He had weapons and overseers and legal right to do whatever he wanted to people he owned. But power, real power, comes from making people afraid, and Elias wasn't afraid anymore. As he lay in the dirt, body broken but mind clearer than years, Elias began to plan. Not an escape this time. Something else. Something turning Foram's own weapon against him. Something taking the cage meant to terrify and making it serve justice instead. He just needed help, and he knew exactly who to ask. Caleb was 31 and had been at Hollow Pines for 8 years. Arrived in 1843. Purchased from a Virginia estate sale after his previous owner drank himself to death, leaving nothing but debts. Caleb learned to survive by being useful but unremarkable. Strong enough to work hard, smart enough to avoid obvious trouble, careful enough never to give Foram reason to single him out for punishment. But like Elias, Caleb kept a flame alive inside. He'd watched over the years as people tried escaping and failed. Watched them die in that cage. Felt his hatred for Foram grow with each death. Learned to hide that hatred behind a submission mask. But it was always there. Always burning. Always waiting for the right moment. Watching what happened with Elias and the cage. Watching Foram break his promise in front of everyone. Watching the plantation owner reveal his word was worthless. His promises lies. Even the impossible achievement of surviving 24 hours with beast meaning nothing. That was the moment Caleb had been waiting for without knowing he was waiting. Foram had shown weakness. shown he was afraid of what it would mean if someone actually survived the cage and claimed freedom, shown his entire system was built on lies he'd break the moment they threatened control. And that weakness, that crack in the facade, was an opportunity that might never come again. 2 nights after Elias's time in the cage, Caleb approached him in slave quarters darkness. Most people already asleep, exhausted from another brutal labor day under Georgia's sun. Caleb moved silently, a skill refined over 8 years of trying to be invisible. "Elias," he whispered, voice barely audible. "You awake?" Elias was awake, had barely slept since the cage. Mind too active, too full of rage and plans, and understanding he had nothing left to lose.
"Yeah,"
he whispered back. "What you did, surviving in there, changed something. People saw it. Saw a beast not attack you. Saw Forearm break his promise. His word don't mean nothing no more. And everybody knows it."
"I know."
"I've been thinking." Caleb continued moving closer so words wouldn't carry. "About that cage. About beast. About promises. Forearm likes making promises about 24 hours in that cage. Maybe it's time somebody made him the same promise." The words hung in darkness. Dangerous and thrilling and absolutely insane. Elias turned his head slightly, trying to make out Caleb's expression in gloom. "You know what you're saying. You know what would happen if we tried and failed." "I know. They wouldn't just kill us. They'd make it last. Make it public. Use us as examples." Caleb paused. "But you broke something when you survived. You showed Forearm's system ain't perfect. That beast can be confused. That surviving is possible. We do this. And even if it fails, even if they kill us, people will remember. People will know somebody fought back. Somebody made Forearm face his own cage." Elias was quiet a long moment, mind racing through possibilities and dangers and terrible rebellion calculus. Finally he said, "We'd need help. Can't do it alone, but anyone helping risks their life. Who could we trust?" "I know one person," Caleb said. "Mary. She works in the big house. Has access to places we don't, keys, supplies, knowledge of Forearm's routines. And she hates him more than anybody." Mary was 50 years old and had been at Hollow Pines since she was 15. She'd been forced into Forearm's bed at 16. Born 3 of his children over years. Children looking enough like their father, they were constant reminders of his hypocrisy and crimes. Forearm had sold all 3 when they were young, sent them to other plantations where they wouldn't be visible reminders of his violations. Mary's hatred for Forearm was absolute, refined over 35 years into something cold and patient and utterly implacable. "Will she help?" Elias asked.
"Yes,"
Caleb said with certainty. "She's been waiting for a chance like this for decades. We just have to ask. When? Soon. Tomorrow night. Before he settles down. Before patrols get comfortable again. When everyone's still nervous and not paying attention properly." It was insane, impossible. Exactly the kind of desperate plan working only in stories. Not the real world where enslaved people who fought back were killed slowly and publicly as warnings to others. But Elias found himself nodding in darkness. "Tomorrow night," he agreed. They didn't shake hands, didn't make speeches, didn't pray, because if God existed, he'd been notably absent from Hollow Pines for a very long time. They just lay back down and pretended to sleep, while minds raced with details and fears and knowledge that in 24 hours they'd either be free or dead. The next day passed with agonizing slowness. Elias and Caleb worked fields, picking cotton until fingers bled, backs bent under merciless sun, saying nothing to each other, drawing no attention. Just 2 more enslaved people among many, invisible in labor, unremarkable in suffering. Mary went about big house duties, cleaning, cooking, serving Forearm his meals, while her mind worked through the plan Caleb had whispered pre-dawn darkness. She moved through the mansion with ease of someone working there 35 years. Someone overseers and Forom's wife barely noticed anymore. Someone just part of furniture. But while she worked, she stole small things. Things not missed immediately. A kitchen knife hidden in apron. A key from Forom's study. The key she'd seen him use unlocking the cage. Slipped from his desk drawer while she cleaned and replaced with similar-looking key that wouldn't work. Matches from beside fireplace. A small flask of lamp oil. And most importantly, the drug she'd been stealing for the past year, saving tiny amounts each time Forom's wife used it for headaches and nerves. Laudanum, opium dissolved in alcohol. Small doses eased pain. Larger doses brought sleep. The dose Mary had accumulated, dropped by stolen drop over 12 months, would bring unconsciousness lasting hours. As sunset and workers returned from fields exhausted and filthy, the three conspirators moved into position with silent coordination from absolute necessity. They couldn't afford mistakes, couldn't afford hesitation, couldn't afford anyone noticing something different about this particular evening. Forom always ate late. After worst heat passed, an evening brought some relief from brutal Georgia summer. Mary served his dinner as she'd done thousands of times before, moving through familiar routine of placing dishes, pouring wine, standing unobtrusively in corner in case he wanted something. But tonight the wine had been specially prepared. Mary added every laudanum drop she'd saved, stirred carefully to dissolve, masked bitter taste with extra sugar. Enough to kill a smaller man, but Forom was large and had constitution of someone drinking heavily for years. It would put him under. Probably wouldn't kill him. Probably. 20 minutes after finishing second wine glass, Augustus Forom felt suddenly overwhelmingly tired. The room seemed to tilt slightly, limbs heavy, disconnected from will. He tried standing from dining table and found legs weren't responding properly. He started, but words tangled on tongue. Mary was there immediately, face carefully expressionless. "You've had too much wine again, sir," she said loudly enough for kitchen house slaves to hear. "Let me help you to bed." It was a familiar scene. Forom's drinking was well known among household staff. No one questioned when Mary half carried, half dragged him away from table. They probably assumed he'd wake with terrible headache in morning and be in foul mood for days, which wouldn't be unusual. But instead of taking him to bedroom, Mary opened a side door leading outside. Caleb and Elias waited in shadows, hearts pounding so hard they could hear their own blood in ears. They grabbed Forom and moved quickly across grounds, staying in darkness between buildings, avoiding the few overseers still awake. The plantation was large, and the cage sat some distance from main house. They had perhaps 5 minutes before someone might notice something wrong. They reached the cage just as Forom was starting to regain some consciousness, starting to mumble questions, not quite forming coherent words. Inside the cage, Beast raised its massive head, suddenly alert. The animal recognized approaching human sounds. It meant feeding time. Caleb used Mary's stolen key to unlock the cage door. The sound of metal scraping on metal seemed impossibly loud in quiet night, like alarm bell announcing their crime. Inside the cage, Beast stood up, all 600 Ellaby of trained killer ready for whatever prey would be thrown inside. They lifted Forom, dead weight in their arms, and threw him through open door. The plantation owner hit ground hard, impact jarring him closer to full consciousness. He managed rolling onto side, managed pushing up to hands and knees, looked up with drug-hazed, confused eyes. "What? Where am I?" he slurred. Then, vision focused enough to see surrounding iron bars, and understanding cut through laudanum fog like knife. Eyes went wide with terror almost comical in its suddenness. No. No, 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 no. Let me out. That's an order. Elias stepped close to bars. Close enough Forum could see his face clearly in moonlight. The plantation owner recognized him immediately, saw the man who'd survived 24 hours with Beast, and understanding became horror. 24 hours, Elias said, voice steady and cold and absolutely without mercy. If you survive 24 hours, you're free. You have my word. As a gentleman. The words hit Forum like physical blows. His own promise, his own rules, his own game turned back on him. He lurched to feet, staggered toward cage door, but Caleb had already locked it. The same lock trapping 17 people before him. The same cage that had been his favorite instrument of control and terror. You can't do this, Forum said, and voice cracked with fear in a way none of them had ever heard before. The always confident plantation owner, the man ruling them with absolute power, suddenly sounded small and desperate and human. I'm a white man, your property. This is rebellion. They'll kill you all for this. Your orders don't mean nothing no more, Caleb said quietly. You showed us that when you broke your word to Elias. If your promises don't matter, why should your orders? Behind Forum, Beast took a step forward, then another. The animal's nose tested air, catching the scent of fear pouring off Forum like sweat. This was familiar. This was what prey smelled like. This was what the humans thrown into the cage always smelled like. Beast's lips pulled back, revealing yellowed teeth. A low rumble started deep in the animal's chest. Please, Forum whispered, and that word, coming from a man who'd never shown mercy in his entire life, carried a kind of justice all three felt in bones. Please, I'll sign freedom papers for all of you, for everyone.
Just let me out. 24 hours,
Elias repeated. That's the deal. Just like you told me. Just like you told 17 others before me. They didn't stay to watch. Couldn't stay, because they had other things to do. Other people to save. While Forum's overseers were confused and disorganized, they moved quickly toward slave quarters, where people were starting to stir, awakened by Forum's screaming beginning behind them. Elias, Caleb, and Mary woke people up, told them in urgent whispers that if they wanted to leave, tonight was the night. Overseers would be distracted. Forum was occupied. There might not be another chance. Some people chose to run that night. 12 men and women waiting for opportunity, dreaming of freedom, having enough hope left to believe the North was real and reachable. Others were too frightened, convinced this was trap, unable to believe Forum could actually be beaten. They stayed in quarters, praying they wouldn't be punished for what was happening. Elias, Caleb, Mary, and the 12 others moved into forest, using paths Elias learned during his failed escape attempt. Behind them, chaos erupted at Hollow Pines. Someone had found the cage and seen Forum inside. Screaming attracted attention. Overseers ran in all directions, some toward cage, others to check slave quarters. Everyone confused and frightened because the order of things had been fundamentally disrupted. From deep in forest, the runners could hear sounds carrying through night. Screaming, roaring. The awful sounds of Beast doing what Beast had been trained to do, but this time to the man who'd created the monster. None of them looked back. When overseers finally worked up courage to approach cage in morning light, they found very little. Beast sat in corner, muzzle stained dark, breathing heavy and satisfied. The cage ground was torn up, blood-soaked earth even darker than usual in spots. And in the cage center, like marker on grave, they found Augustus Forum's top hat. Somehow it remained untouched, sitting upright and perfectly positioned. Beside it lay the cage key, the key Mary stole and Caleb dropped inside before they left. A message, a reminder. The same cage locking others and had been used to lock Forum inside. They never found Forum's body. Not most of it anyway. Beast had fed well, consumed what 600 lb of trained killer could consume. done exactly what it had been trained to do for 5 years. Overseers found some things they didn't look at too closely. Some remnants they buried quickly, without talking about what they'd seen. But Augustus' forearm in any recognizable form was gone. The plantation fell apart within weeks. Without forearm, overseers fought among themselves. Who was in charge? Who had authority? Who could make decisions? Forearm's wife, always pretending not to know full extent of husband's cruelties, fled to family in Savannah and never returned. The bank holding Hollow Pine's mortgage tried finding someone to manage it. But word spread about what happened. About the cage, about forearm, about Beast. No one wanted the job. Many enslaved people simply walked away. No organized force to stop them, no Beast to hunt them down. Some got caught by slave catchers and returned to other plantations. Others made it to freedom in the north. The system, seeming so absolute, so unbreakable, collapsed in months once the man building it was gone. Beast, without its trainer, became different. The animal broke out of cage one night, bending bars, holding humans, but not quite strong enough for 600 lb of determined bear. It disappeared into Georgia wilderness, and sightings of massive black bear became common in region for years afterward. Hunters tracking it said the bear seemed to avoid humans now, seemed to have lost whatever taste for human flesh it had been trained to have. It lived wild and free until old age took it sometime in the 1860s. Elias, Caleb, Mary, and their companions made it to safe station on Underground Railroad 3 days after leaving Hollow Pines. They were fed, given clean clothes, helped on their way north. From there they scattered to different destinations, different lives, different futures they got to choose themselves. Elias made it to Pennsylvania, found work as free man, lived to see Civil War end slavery across entire South. He married, had children, told them stories about Georgia, and a cage, and a bear choosing mercy when a man wouldn't. His grandchildren later said he never quite lost a certain wariness, a way of looking over shoulder as if expecting pursuit. But he died free in his own bed, surrounded by family loving him. Caleb went to Canada, as far from south as he could get, worked on farm outside Toronto. He never talked much about slavery time, but those knowing him said every August 15th, the anniversary of night, they put forearm in cage. Caleb would raise whiskey glass and silent toast to something or someone, and small smile would cross his normally serious face. Mary made it to Boston, worked as seamstress, became active in abolitionist movement. She spoke at gatherings, telling her story. Using forearm's cruelty and downfall as evidence, slavery was not only immoral, but ultimately unsustainable. She lived to be 78, long enough to see slavery abolished, long enough to vote in first election, long enough to know she'd won. And the story of what happened at Hollow Pines spread, told and retold, gaining details and embellishments with each telling, becoming something between history and legend. Some versions said Beast refused to attack forearm at all. That plantation owner died of fear alone. Others said ghosts of everyone dying in that cage appeared demanding justice. Some claimed Elias had supernatural powers, cursed forearm, that God himself intervened. The truth was simpler and perhaps more powerful. 3 people treated as property, told entire lives they were less than human, had found a way to turn their oppressor's own weapon against him. They'd used intelligence, courage, and opportunity to prove no oppression system is truly permanent. That those building cages should remember cages work both ways. And that justice, though delayed, often finds its way home. The site where Hollow Pines once stood is empty now, long since reclaimed by Georgia forest. Mansion collapsed decades ago. Fields returned to wilderness. Slave quarters rotted and disappeared. Even the infamous cage, that iron and terror structure, was eventually torn down for scrap metal during one of America's wars. But sometimes, local people say, on August nights when air is thick and hot, if you're in woods where hollow pines used to be, you can hear things. Not screams exactly, more like echoes. Like the sound of a promise being broken, and then a promise being kept. Like the sound of justice being served cold and patient and absolutely final. And they say sometimes a massive black bear is still spotted in those woods. One with old scars and eyes, holding something like memory. The bear never bothers people. Hunters say it just watches, as if standing guard over something, as if remembering, and then it disappears back into forest, wild and free, the way bears are supposed to be. Maybe it's true. Maybe it's just stories people tell because they need to believe that sometimes against all odds, justice wins. That courage and intelligence can overcome brute force. That those building power on others, suffering will eventually face accounting. That 24 hours can change everything. In the end, does it matter if every detail is literally true? The important truth is this. Augustus Forum built a cage thinking it made him powerful, created a monster thinking it made him safe, made promises thinking they gave him control. He was wrong on all counts. Cages work both ways. Monsters can choose mercy when men won't, and promises once broken can never be unbroken. But promises kept, those echo through history. Elias survived his 24 hours and earned his freedom. Even if he had to take it rather than receive it, Forum made a promise of 24 hours leading to freedom. And in the end, someone held him to the exact same terms. Justice was served in a cage by a beast under Georgia stars. And if that's not poetry, nothing is.